Good day, New Zealand. Barry here, speaking for Voters' Voice. Hope you're all well. I am reporting that I have been a bit slow getting this latest video out due to a bout with COVID. That's slowed me up a little bit for the last 2 or 3 weeks. However, it's behind me now and I am at the point of recovery, so here I am. And while I've been lazing about, not doing too much, I've given a lot of thought to these videos that I make and what I try to impart from them. And I've come to a fairly robust conclusion, which I'm going to share with you, rightly or wrongly. So bear with me. The history of the older generations, that is, I'm 82 and I'm talking about my parents and uncles and aunts and even my grandparents, is vastly different from today's generation of people who are striving to make ends meet in the present world. They had the most dramatic, one could say horrific, experiences throughout their life. Right back into the late 19th century, there were depressions and economic downturns that created real hardship for the people. Bringing them through those generations, and remember, my grandparents were close to that era. Coming through to 1918, when the First World War, with the consequences to world upheaval, civilization, economies, entire countries, huge upheavals in the world that directly affected everybody. That settled down, it was put behind them, and they tried to get on with their lives. And the next thing, the depression of the 1929-39 era descended upon them. The scrabble to survive all over the world was draconian, horrific. Here in New Zealand, owing to our agricultural economy, where the bulk of our income for the country was derived from agriculture, and the bulk of the population was engaged in that activity, and therefore had a very direct access to the basic necessities of life. That actually created more of a cushion than was realised at the time, where people could help each other with food, milk, even accommodation, to a larger degree than would ever be possible today. So the generation that was my direct grandparents, my grandmother, and my parents as children suffered in that time era of the First World War. And then we're thrown pitchforked into the depression of the 1929-39 era. And it was a full-time commitment just to survive. They had to apply every ounce of their being, every effort in their bodies and their mentality to constructing enough around them to enable them to keep body and soul together. They struggled along through that, and if you can imagine what conditioning that does to the human psyche, in actual fact, I doubt very much whether the younger generation of today, the ones that have come well after myself, can conceive. They have nothing to compare it with. They can't grasp just how difficult and mind-numbingly overtaking every aspect of their lives that era presented itself to them as. The survivors of the First World War then had to survive the Depression, and as a reward were then thrown into the Second World War, where not my grandparents' generation now, my parents' generation had to suffer yet again the horrific conflict that broke out all over the world, that decimated economies, killed millions upon millions of people, destroyed entire civilizations. A horrific event that everybody in the world, some more than others, although the bulk of them were definitely caught up in a major way. So they experienced this colossal upheaval. Now, that's the background to what I'm about to try and impart now in my very poor way. I wish I had the gift of an incredibly adequate orator, but you'll have to make do with my poor effort. As time goes on, the upheavals of those days disappear into the past. The depression that my grandparents had to suffer through was 29-39. The World War that my parents had to suffer through, having survived as children the Depression era, were thrown as adults into the Second World War. And they had to cope one way or another. Their relatives, their brothers, sisters, their uncles and aunts were slaughtered by the thousands. The repercussions to their home way of life was dramatic, to say the least. Every effort of their being was put into surviving and coping. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, the generations that had weathered that cataclysm had to cope with rebuilding the world and getting the economies back onto some sort of steady footing. So the 1950s brought major efforts in exports and what have yous, as the decimated population strove to cope with the aftermath of these huge upheavals that had gone on for 100 years. There wasn't a person on earth at that time that hadn't been affected by these events, and affected in dramatic ways. And I can recall as a boy of, I would have been 5 or 6 years old, when the 1950s brought about, to all intents and purposes, a general strike in New Zealand, a major upheaval by the working classes who decided that they were not getting a fair measure of the new economy that they were struggling to build, and by their efforts had increased the wealth of this nation They were being relegated to a very secondary role. Their wages hadn't gone up. It was the wealth was being retained by the few, and they rebelled and went on a strike that, to all intents and purposes in New Zealand, created a general strike. The railways on strike, the wharfies, all the exports and imports, they were held up. Construction on major dam projects, everything came to a halt while this battle over the fair, equitable sharing of income was fought. And they succeeded in having, because they formed unions and stuck together and were prepared to sacrifice. They went on strike, they went without, they had real hardship, but they fought against the government that was not treating them right, and eventually they overcome. And at that point we entered into a relative time of equitable sharing of wealth, which lasted from the end of the 50s and through to the 1970s, basically. Now, what happened then? The older generations, my grandmother's, grandparents' generation, began to die off, so their experiences were lost. The people that had gone through the Depression and the Second World War and then fought the major Union battles of the 1950s, they become better off. They bought their houses. They began to accumulate a decent standard of life that had been out of their reach for generation upon generation. Even myself, when I was a pre-teenager, in 12 years old, would never have imagined that I could eventually buy my own house or even own a decent automobile. It seems incredible to today's generation that that was the thinking. But there it was. We had come through cataclysmic times, and the people that had been tempered by those times had learnt to stand up for themselves, to speak up, to control what their governments were doing. When it got too far out of line, they rebelled. And by their actions of participating in the political machinery and the political stature, if you like, controlled their fate to a large degree. Which brings me to the present time and my contemplations while I was laid up with COVID as to what has changed. Because changed it most certainly has. And I come back to something that I've said in the past several times. The present generation have had it so easy, haven't had to strive to put a meal on the table or clothing on their back. They haven't been tempered in the fire, as Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore said. They've not been put to the test. Thankfully, in many, many ways, we've lived in an era, not so much my age group, but the ones that came after me most certainly have lived in an era where they didn't know these conflagrations, these shocking, horrific political and economic upheavals. They've been able to cruise along really without sacrificing the major part of their lives to merely surviving. And that has led to the bulk of the population of today being far too ready to accept what the governments present them with. They don't challenge it anymore. To them, it's none of their business. Let the government get on with it. I'm busy with my life. I can't be bothered with what they're doing. No, what does it matter what they do? Well, it does matter. Every action has a reaction and consequences. And a lack of interest by the population allows those consequences to run away with the reality of life. And this is what is happening in the world today. Government decisions have grave consequences. And when citizens take no interest in what their governments are about, the consequences to themselves will be severe. And I, for one, obviously lack the skills to make this obvious, to allow the people of today who have had a very cruisy existence for the last 50 years to let them open their eyes and see that in fact their cruisy existence today is being bought at the expense of their freedom. That today's governments are becoming far more authoritarian. That in many respects the way we are being politically manoeuvred in the Western world is a direct exchange and swap for what used to go on in the Soviet Union, where small groups of people, unelected, make decisions that affect entire generations. And they had no say in those decisions, no control over what was being done to them. And this is what is happening in our society today. The freedom of speech is being curtailed. The information that we are fed through our media is curtailed. Our so-called leaders do not lead us, they herd us. And they herd us in the direction that is beneficial to the few at the expense of the many. They have ideology system where in the universities and the breeding grounds of these systems that they grasp to their chests are born and raised and nurtured, and the consequences of which we get things like gender issues. We're told we're racists. We're told our history is completely at odds with a decent living. That we're bad people. We have to be, our ways have to change. And this is being organised for us by the few. Why? Why is it that the banking fraternity can decide that they're going to close all the banks in the Western world, move away from cash, instigate a system of electronic banking that will give total control over the population, while the population sits on its hands, doesn't look up from its preoccupations or its cell phones, its amusing games, its sports, its entertainments, its films, and ignores what is happening to them Basically, that's my talk for today. If the people of today continue to allow themselves to be manoeuvred by these people who have gained control, they've gained control because the rest of us have lost interest in what they do. Until recently, that hasn't bothered the average person too much. There's been enough shared that most people in the world, not all by any means, but certainly if I'm talking about New Zealand, we've had a pretty good existence here in this country for a long time now. But if you stop and examine what is now apparent to our future, I just think that nobody that examines the facts, the real facts of what's going on, where our leaders are leading us into economic ruin because they've tied their wagon to the American agenda and the UK agenda. Europe is crashing economically. Germany has just gone into a recession, a deep recession. And if the measurement of that recession was being measured in the old way, it would be a depression, as was suffered in the 1930s. The powers that be that are controlling the civilizations that I'm talking about have decided they no longer include housing or fuel in the costs when they measure inflation. So the inflation figures were looking, oh, this is not good. The population eventually will wake up and they might kick back and throw us all out and take back control. We better measure things a bit differently, otherwise they'll wake up and decide that things aren't too good. They're all disinterested in what we do, so all we'll do is we'll remove the cost of housing and the cost of fuel for your vehicles and heating your homes and cooking your food and allowing your industries to operate and employ you. We'll remove those from the inflation figures. If today's people, citizens, continue to put their head in the sand, ignore what is being done to them, ignore the facts of the reality of what is going on in the economies of the Western world, where there has been such a reversal of fortunes that it's actually a bigger upheaval than all those events that I described earlier in this talk. Today's change of direction is going to be far more damaging, certainly to the collective West's governments and its people, than any of those events I've described earlier. And if we continue to allow our so-called leaders to go on this mad, desperate race to destruction, the only people we can blame for it are ourselves. That's my talk for today. I know I go on. I know most of you think I'm raving on and don't need to be listened to. The story I tell and the warnings I give are the ravings of a befuddled old mind. So be it. As I've said in the past, the repercussions to myself are going to be minor. I won't be around long enough to have to suffer them for very much longer. But you will. And your children will. And your grandchildren will. And if you want to, in your very old age, look back and decide, well, maybe I should have acted. Maybe I should have looked up to see what was being done to me and to comment on it and to shape our future for ourselves. Perhaps by this time you may think my talks aren't so far off the mark, but unfortunately, if that is the situation, it's too late, isn't it? Because unless you act now, unless you take an interest now, that future is going to become your present time. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and look after yourselves. Hope you all have good health. And I'll catch you another day. Thank you for listening to me. Cheerio.